So what's the deal with North Korea? Why North Korea's economy is booming? I'm actually curious about this. I've been a little bit bullish on North Korea economically for a while because it kind of seems like their main issue is that they're incredibly reliant on imports, especially for stuff like food, but they are also uniquely immune to financialization. So they're like the one economy in the world that has to find other ways of doing corruption. You know what I mean? Like every other economy in some form or another is susceptible to the global creep of financialization, but in their case they have to do corruption the old-fashioned way, which might mean in the long run they actually end up building. I'll tell you this much. In North Korea, it would not cost $15 billion to build a bridge between Oregon and Washington.
Every 5 years, North Korea holds a Workers' Party Congress. At the one before last, in 2021, Kim Jong-un was a sorry sight. The economy was a mess. COVID was sweeping across the country, and things were so bad that Kim was forced to tearfully apologise for his failures. At the most recent one earlier this year, however,
See, Trump doesn't have to do that, which is the real democracy.
Times were very different. Kim triumphantly declared that North Korea was in a glorious and more prosperous era, promising, quote, both sweets and bullets, with the implication being that North Korea's economy is doing well enough to both provide for its people and fund its nuke-centric military program. So in this video, we're going to look at the North Korean
Sorry, this is kind of nonsense. Wait, how? It's only been like 30 seconds. What happened?
Economy, and why it's apparently doing all right. Trump has launched so many military interventions, it's kind of hard to keep track. So in the war, the North Korea case. So let's start with a bit of history. Because while North Korea is today generally perceived as an economic basket case, this wasn't always the case. In fact, in the first decades after the Korean War, the North Korean economy actually outperformed South Korea.
Yeah.
This was in part thanks to copious amounts of aid from its communist allies, China and the Soviet Union, which was then channeled into a Soviet-style command economy centered around heavy industry.
Yeah, but they were propped up. In fairness, so was South Korea. After the Korean War, we propped up a brutal South Korean dictator. South Korea only became democratic in the 1980s. Isn't that fucked up? 80s. It's crazy, but like they were a fascist dictatorship.
According to CIA estimates, by 1960, North Korea was, on a per capita basis, substantially wealthier than its southern neighbour. However, North Korea's growth rates began to slow in the 1960s. This was in part because North Korea's first leader, Kim Il-sung, aligned himself with China after the Sino-Soviet split, prompting a steep reduction in Soviet aid. But it was also because Kim really doubled down on his policy of juche, or self-reliance, and minimised trade with the outside world. Many socialist/communist states pursued similar policies, but none to the same degree as North Korea, which even pulled back from the Soviet-led Comecon trade bloc. Somewhat unsurprisingly, this didn't work, and in the 1970s, North Korea started borrowing heavily on international markets in order to import advanced machinery, which it couldn't produce domestically. But exports remained weak, and whatever foreign currency North Korea could accumulate was mostly spent on energy imports, especially after the 1973 oil crisis, leading to a series of defaults in the mid-1970s. The country didn't really have a financial sector, so to speak, so it didn't
God bless.
experience the sort of financial crisis that sovereign defaults usually engender. But this did...
Well, you handing like a foreclosure notice to North Korea. This doesn't matter to me because I don't have financial markets. Well, I can't read. Me when I serve the fucking debt notice to North Korea and they just tear it up in front of my face and I realize I have literally no mechanism of punishing them.
Mean that North Korea could no longer borrow on international markets, which limited its access to foreign imports and effectively pushed the country back towards autarky. This is when the gap between North and South Korea really started to open up. But things then got even worse with the collapse of the Soviet Union around 1990, which put an end to both direct Soviet aid and subsidized Soviet oil. This triggered a severe economic crisis culminating in an appalling famine. Out of a total population of 22 million, somewhere between 300,000 and 3 million people starved to death.
That's not good.
With millions more suffering from acute malnutrition. The state receded in this period.
North Korea has a really bad, I guess you'd call it, I don't know, Civ 4 starting location when it comes to oil. I mean, like even China. China imports a fuck ton of oil and coal. Or not, is it oil or coal? Oil. They import fuck ton of oil. But also food. North Korea's cold. North Korea is really cold and like rocky. it's not great for agriculture.
Because it literally lacked the resources to monitor and command the economy. And as the economy began to recover in the 2000s, an informal market-based economy expanded in its...
Nah, man, worst countries managed? I don't know what we're not competing. I'm just talking. What do you mean worst countries do you disagree with my assessment that North Korea has bad, like, agricultural...
place. This was also when the Chinese economy was really taking off, which was good news for North Korea, given China is basically the only country it trades with.
I mean, so is Japan. What happened? Japan's agriculturally fine. Japan has tons of fertile agricultural land. Japan's population boomed like well before like international trade kicked off. It's mostly mountains. Yeah, but they do fine with their rice and they fish. That's all they eat anyway.
North Korea doesn't publish its own GDP figures, but estimates from the South Korean Central Bank, the Bank of Korea, suggest that the North Korean economy posted solid GDP growth throughout the early 2000s. However, growth rates slowed in the late 2000s, largely due to gradually escalating UN sanctions after North Korea's first nuclear test in 2006. Growth rates then cratered in the mid-2010s, in large part because China, which had previously helped water down any UN-level sanctions, agreed to substantially stronger sanctions in 2016 and 2017. This meant that the North Korean economy was already in a bit of a state going into the pandemic, which proved utterly ruinous. Trade with China collapsed, taking the economy with it.
Japan is massively dependent upon food imports. They're just a rich country. Yeah. But they weren't. The default position agriculturally for Japan is better than that for North Korea. They relied historically on rice fields and fishing, and to this day they still largely do. Yes, they're not getting their fucking oranges locally. They were reliant though. Masaigu, you're already at like 20 posts arguing with me today. You can't keep doing this. You're gonna be in the goddamn backbenches. Okay? Yes. Japan had a hard time maintaining its post-fucking 1930s population because they had a gigantic boom that was fueled off of like the invasion of Manchuria. But I'm talking about like generally. Are we really arguing this? Are we really arguing that generally speaking, Japan has a harder time getting food than North Korea? This is what I mean, like missing the forest for the trees. You all know what I'm saying. North Korea has a bad environment for agriculture. But like, I guess we have to like argue the minutia now. No, North Korea does not have 50 billion miles of coast like Japan with which to fish, and they do not have the same rice. Japan's just a terrible example. No, it's not. Japan's not a terrible example. They have a better time getting food than North Korea. It's not a terrible example. Quit trying to flex me with your knowledge. We get it, okay? Canada, Japan. My point is correct.
Deprived of fertilizer and hit by severe typhoons, domestic crop production plummeted, creating widespread food insecurity. North Korea's public health system was, unsurprisingly, unable to cope with the wave of infections that swept through the population. It was such a disaster that, at the party congress in January 2021, Kim was forced into an utterly unprecedented teary-eyed apology on national television. However, in the years since, the North Korean economy has seemingly roared back to health, with the Bank of Korea estimating more than 3% GDP growth every year since 2023. This is plausibly an underestimate as well. Since the expansion of the informal economy in the 2000s, a gap has opened up between the Bank of Korea's GDP estimates and the growth in nighttime light activity, which economists generally consider to be a pretty good proxy for GDP, suggesting the Bank of Korea might actually be understating North Korea's real growth rates. Similarly, more recent nighttime light data from Pyongyang specifically suggest that capital's luminosity has essentially doubled since the pandemic.
No, Vinny, I was never completely wrong. I was always completely right. North Korea generally suffers from infertile sandy soils and mountainous terrain with only about 17% of its landmass being arable. Yeah, I know. I said it. When I said it was correct. Ugh, honestly. Yeah, they just don't have a good food situation. It's not ideal for them.
Kim has also announced the completion of some big-ticket infrastructure projects recently, including, last month, a number of long-delayed hydroelectric power plants, which have historically accounted for the majority of North Korea's power output. It's obviously not hard data, but foreigners who visited the capital, Pyongyang, claim that the city is noticeably more developed than it was only a few years ago. So, what's gone right? Well, we see at least 3 reasons. First, Russia. North Korea has provided
Google. Okay, Masaigu, you insisted on pressing this, which means you're gambling the mute on it. Google. North Korea agriculture versus Japan. Land and geography. Roughly 80% of North Korea is mountainous, leaving only 14 to 20% of its land as arable. The climate features short growing seasons and harsh winters, which historically restrict output. Versus Japan. Japan also has mountainous terrain, but makes intensive use of its valleys and coastal plains. Are we going to argue Japan has less coastline than North Korea? Japanese agriculture is characterized by small but incredibly high yield farms. It's also a climate thing. Also difference in coastline. Where is he? Where is he? Where is he? Where's that chat? Pissing me off.
Arms troops and even construction workers to help Russia during its war against Ukraine, which has proved incredibly lucrative for the regime and provided Kim with a much needed source of foreign currency. Second, China. China is no longer enforcing UN sanctions as stringently as it did in the late 2010s, and trade between the countries has duly boomed, which has helped the North Korean economy benefit from what we might describe as
like my understanding of North Korea's climate, or I guess Korea's broadly, I guess, is that the United States military deployed in Europe in World War II. Obviously, you might recall that, World War II. But when we deployed to Korea, we found that our equipment was woefully insubstantial when compared to the Korean winters. Like we had there, you have snow in Germany, you have snow in France, but our boys were like freezing to death out there in Korea. So we had to build out like a fuck ton of extremely cold weather clothing for climates that the US military had never fought in.
Spillover effects from China's ongoing economic growth. North Korea has also benefited from what Western policymakers describe as China's overcapacity, which has allowed it to import Chinese solar panels and electric cars at rock-bottom prices. Third, sanctions. Not only are the UN sanctions not being enforced properly, the non-UN sanctions, coordinated mostly by the US and its allies, have also become less effective over time. This is part of a more general story. As the US has imposed sanctions with increasing frequency, the rest of the world has created more and more workarounds to insulate themselves, hence their waning efficacy. Now, of course, it's important not to overstate this. North Korea still has, in dollar terms, a GDP per capita in the low thousands. It's also worth noting that, while Pyongyang might look all right to tourists, the rest of the country is a lot poorer. Nonetheless, as the change in tone between the two most recent party
So the less it is even North Korea is able to develop its economy. Look, North Korea is a very, very, very poorly run country, okay? However, they were always going to industrialize at some point. Like, the fact that they're a dictatorship doesn't mean they can't industrialize. Inevitably, they will catch up, or at least the gap will narrow a bit. The big difference here essentially being that over the past 50, 60 years or whatever, the West isn't really infrastructurally developing at all. Like, the difference between what America looks like now and 50 years ago is negligible. The difference between what China looks like now and 50 years ago is fucking unbelievable. Unbelievable difference. North Korea was inevitably going to have that process play out as well. And I do think there are some economic lessons that can be learned from North Korea. Maybe not in practice, because again, it's a poorly run country, but in like concept, some degree of local resilience and not over relying on global trade. Keep in mind that the era of global trade has been built largely off of extremely cheap and readily available fuel, which, as we're seeing, is not as much of a given than as we might like. So yeah, seems to be based on this article. World's most surprising economic success story is North Korea. Shit happens,
is made clear, it's at least true that the economy is doing a lot better than it was, and this is probably bad news for anyone who doesn't want an emboldened North Korea. When a story like this breaks, the headlines aren't just fast, they're fragmented. Depending on where you get your news, you might be seeing...
Okay, yeah, we're not working with a lot of information. The info we get on North Korea is not really reliable, but it does seem like they're producing quite a bit, relatively. GDP growing about 3.7% recent years. I don't know how well GDP measures growth in North Korea. Again, they're not a capitalist economy. Like, maybe their GDP is growing, but they're booming more than you might expect for that growth. Using a GDP-like metric's very vague here. Yeah, you probably shouldn't use GDP to measure a country's development, like, at all. It just doesn't work in this case. How many people are being fed adequately? Average calories per day, literacy. Like, you should measure actual meaningful metrics for human development, Literacy, calories per day. There are indices of development that you can use that are a little bit more directly related to a person's lived experience and not just like an abstract representation of how much monetary wealth exchanges, day to day. Is there a measurement for that? For literacy and average calories per day? Yes, we can measure those. Well, we could, but we can't in North Korea. It's not like they let, World Bank statisticians in there to, do studies on how much people eat. So, be nice if we could. Measure their skulls? Well, you can measure their height, you know? North Koreans on average are quite short, like shorter than South Koreans, though that difference, that gap does seem to be closing a little bit. Just a little. This, I've read some critiques of the Human Development Index, but it's probably a better measurement to use than GDP per capita, for sure. It's been a while since I've read those critiques, though, so I don't really remember the nature of the issue. Yeah, we have no data on North Korea. It's like the only place we have no data on, basically. Not the only, but you know. You might notice that Saudi Arabia is doing very well according to the Human Development Index, so worth keeping in mind that there are some serious problems with their methodology. Do you think the UAE is counting the HDI of like the Indian slaves they bring over? Probably not. Yeah, light output is a good metric, Kowalski, for sure. The propagation of solar across North Korea is going to make a huge difference in how often they're able to keep the lights on, which is nice. I want North Korea to do well, not because I like the North Korean regime. They're very evil. But rather because I think it's going to be interesting as the global financial order starts to become more unstable in the future to have any counterexample to point to. Like, my investment in China's growth has less to do with me glazing the CCP, which I think is meeting a bare minimum criteria by caring about civilization. But more so, like, it's just interesting to have counterexamples to point to. What does that mean? Well, I think a lot of people are just so hopelessly mired in capitalist realism they can't even imagine what a counterexample might look like. Like people are genuinely like, how can a society not have debt? How could a society not have credit cards? What would decommodified housing even look like? Like every once in a while you bring up a big pivotal change, and sometimes the change is like something that happened relatively recently. Credit cards became a thing back in the 1960s. You know, so much of what we take for granted is a relatively recent development, right? In North Korea, we might get to see an example of what it looks like when, admittedly, an extremely evil dictatorial government is less tied to global capital markets, which, you know, I would like it if we were less tied to global capital markets. Oh, 70s? Okay, 70s, not 60s, sorry. People are like, how could we live without everyone having a smartphone? It's like, damn, dog. I mean, even I did that up until midway through high school. Up until I was like 15, I guess. 15? Yeah, 15 or 16. Like that was very recent. Yeah, it's going to be a rough winter, Galaxy Eater.